April 1945. Southern Okinawa, just after sunrise. The jungle is already awake. Insects hum. Leaves drip from a night of rain. The air is heavy, pressing down on the ground like a held breath. At the edge of a small village, several children stand barefoot in the mud, watching from behind a fallen tree trunk. They do not speak. They listen. A deep mechanical growl cuts through the forest. Steel tracks bite into wet earth. An American bulldozer pushes forward, slow and deliberate, its blade peeling back roots that have not been exposed in decades. Behind it, men in dust-stained uniforms move with practiced calm. They measure. They mark. They shovel. No one shouts. No one runs. There is no battle here. No gunfire. No sudden violence. Only the steady sound of engines and the rhythmic scrape of metal against soil. The children have seen soldiers before. Japanese troops pass through their village quickly, always tense, always in a hurry. These men are different. They stop to drink water. They wipe their hands. They return to the same task again and again, widening a path that did not exist yesterday. By evening, the jungle will be split open. By tomorrow, trucks will roll through. And standing silently in the shade, the children begin to sense that this quiet work, not explosions or speeches, is how the war is being decided. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final, most destructive phase. Japan's outer defensive perimeter, once stretching across the Central Pacific and Southeast Asia, had collapsed island by island. Saipan had fallen in July 1944. Leyte followed in October. Iwo Jima, after weeks of brutal fighting, was declared secure in March 1945. Each loss tightened the noose around the Japanese home islands. Okinawa now stood directly in the path forward. Located just 350 miles from Kyushu, Okinawa was not simply another island. It was the last major barrier before Japan itself. For American planners, it offered airfields for strategic bombers, harbors for the fleet, and staging grounds for a possible invasion of the mainland. For Japan, it was a shield, one that could not be surrendered without existential consequence. Operation Iceberg, launched on April 1, 1945, was the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. More than 180,000 U.S. Army and Marine Corps troops were committed in the opening phase alone. Supporting them was an armada of over 1,300 ships, battleships, carriers, transports, and supply vessels stretching across the horizon. Yet, despite the scale, the initial landings met little resistance. Japanese commanders, led by Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, had chosen not to contest the beaches. Instead, they withdrew into the island's rugged interior, preparing a defense based on depth, concealment, and attrition. The real battle would be fought inland, among ridges, caves, and jungled hills. This strategy had consequences far beyond the battlefield. Okinawa was densely populated. Villages, farms, and schools were scattered across terrain that now became militarized space. Civilians, many of them children, were caught between advancing American forces and Japanese units that often requisitioned food, labor, and shelter. The distinction between front line and rear area blurred almost immediately. For years, Japanese propaganda had prepared the population for invasion. Americans were portrayed as chaotic, brutal, incapable of discipline. Civilians were taught that surrender was dishonor and that defeat would mean annihilation. Children absorbed these messages through school instruction, youth organizations, and constant repetition. But war, when it arrives, rarely conforms to expectation. American doctrine in the Pacific emphasized speed, logistics, and engineering as much as combat power. The U.S. military did not move as a single mass. It advanced as a system, infantry supported by artillery, engineers, medical units, and supply columns designed to function continuously even under fire. On Okinawa, this system became impossible to ignore. Almost immediately after landing, U.S. Navy Seabees and Army engineer units began reshaping the island. Airstrips were expanded. Roads were graded and reinforced. Bridges were repaired or replaced. Bulldozers and graders moved forward almost as closely as the infantry itself. This was not improvisation. It was preparation refined over years of island warfare. American planners understood that jungle terrain could stall momentum if left untouched. Vehicles bogged down. Supplies slowed. Casualties increased. The solution was not merely to fight through the environment, but to remake it, methodically, permanently, and with an eye toward what would come next. For Okinawan civilians, especially children, this kind of warfare was unfamiliar. Japanese troops rarely altered terrain beyond necessity. They moved lightly, avoided machinery, and relied on concealment rather than construction. Roads were used, not built. Positions were hidden, not expanded. The Americans did the opposite. They cut through jungle where no road had existed. They widened paths into supply corridors. They drained low ground and stabilized hillsides. And they did so with a calm regularity that contrasted sharply with the tension and scarcity civilians had come to associate with soldiers. Children watched these changes unfold day by day, not as strategy, not as doctrine, but as visible transformation. Where there had been forest, there was now a road. Where there had been silence, there was now steady movement. Where there had been uncertainty, there was now routine. And as the island itself began to change shape under American hands, a deeper shift, psychological and irreversible, was already underway, setting the stage for what those children would notice next. The roads the Americans built on Okinawa were not symbolic gestures. They were functional arteries, designed to sustain a war that moved forward without pause. Gravel was laid in layers. Drainage was cut to survive monsoon rains. Turns were widened for trucks carrying artillery shells, fuel drums, and prefabricated bridge sections. Every detail reflected anticipation of weather, of wear, of time. This foresight was deliberate. By 1945, the United States had mastered large-scale expeditionary logistics. Factories in California, Michigan, and Pennsylvania produced not only weapons, but spare parts, tools, and heavy machinery specifically intended for overseas construction. Ships arrived not just with troops, but with bulldozers, cranes, graders, and portable sawmills. The war was planned not as a series of battles, but as a continuous process. On Okinawa, this process unfolded in full view of the civilian population. Japanese military doctrine had never prioritized engineering for civilian observation. Fortifications were concealed. Roads were kept narrow to limit bombing exposure. Heavy equipment was scarce and often reserved for rear areas. As fuel shortages worsened, machinery was abandoned or cannibalized for parts. By contrast, American fuel trucks arrived regularly, and their consumption appeared unrestrained. To a child watching from the edge of a village, this abundance was startling. U.S. engineers worked in shifts. When one group rested, another replaced it. Machinery rarely stood idle. If a bulldozer broke down, a repair team arrived. If parts were missing, replacements followed. The work resumed with minimal interruption. The message was unspoken but unmistakable. This effort would not stop. Children saw engineers measuring ground with instruments. They saw maps consulted repeatedly. They saw officers conferring, then machines moving in precise sequence. Nothing appeared rushed. Nothing appeared desperate. Even under threat of artillery or air attack, the work continued. This calm persistence contradicted everything Japanese wartime education had emphasized. Children had been taught that strength was demonstrated through sacrifice, endurance, and emotional intensity. Here, strength appeared quiet, methodical, almost indifferent to fear. As roads expanded, American presence deepened. Medical units followed the engineers. Field kitchens appeared near construction zones. Water purification equipment was set up along streams. These were not temporary arrangements. They were signs of permanence. For Okinawan children, the presence of engineers was often their first sustained exposure to American soldiers. Infantry units passed through quickly, focused and armed. Engineers stayed. They returned to the same locations day after day. Their routines became familiar. Some children began to recognize patterns. They noticed that American soldiers cleaned their tools at the end of each shift, that fuel cans were stacked neatly, that rations were distributed in predictable intervals. Even waste was managed, burned, buried, or hauled away. Disorder did not accumulate. This visibility mattered. Japanese forces, under pressure and increasingly isolated, moved at night. They avoided open work. They dismantled positions rather than build them. Their presence felt temporary, strained, and often secretive. Civilians rarely saw them engaged in sustained, organized labor. The contrast was not ideological. It was observational. As the weeks passed, roads linked airfields to ports. Ports linked supply depots to frontline units. The infrastructure expanded outward, tightening American control not just militarily, but spatially. The island's geography itself was being reorganized around a new power. Children, without language for strategy, understood something essential. The Americans were not just fighting here. They were settling into the landscape. And as those roads pushed deeper into Okinawa's interior, they carried more than trucks and machines. They carried the war's direction forward, toward a decisive point that could no longer be avoided. Angle 1. The child's view, power measured in routine. For Okinawan children, war had always appeared sudden and violent. Shelling came without warning. Soldiers passed through quickly. Fear was sharp, then absent, then sharp again. What the American engineers introduced was different. Repetition. They returned to the same stretches of ground each morning. They marked trees. They cut them down. They cleared roots. They leveled soil. And the next day they did it again, slightly farther forward. Children watched from hillsides, doorways, and cave mouths. No one chased them away. No one shouted. The work went on whether they were observed or not. That indifference was unsettling. It suggested that the engineers were not performing strength, they possessed it. Routine became authority. Where Japanese soldiers had appeared only briefly, Americans stayed. Children learned the rhythms of the day by the sound of engines starting and stopping. They could predict when trucks would arrive. They could tell when a section of road would be finished. The war stopped feeling chaotic. It began to feel scheduled. Angle 2, tactical reality, roads as weapons. From a military perspective, the roads were as decisive as artillery. Okinawa's terrain, mud, jungle, steep ridgelines, favored defenders if movement could be slowed. Japanese strategy depended on that friction. Engineering erased it. Roads allowed artillery to move forward rapidly. Tanks could be repositioned. Casualties could be evacuated faster. Supplies could flow continuously. Every kilometer paved reduced Japanese defensive depth. This was not accidental adaptation. It was doctrine. American planners understood that speed without logistics collapsed. Roads ensured tempo could be controlled. When resistance stiffened, Americans did not rush, they reinforced. When weather worsened, they did not pause, they adapted drainage and surfacing. The road itself became a weapon of inevitability. Angle 3, technology made visible. Unlike infantry combat, engineering was understandable to civilians. Machines replaced mystery with clarity. Children could see cause and effect. Trees removed, ground flattened, vehicles passing. Bulldozers symbolized more than power, they symbolized certainty. Japanese forces had little comparable machinery by 1945. Fuel scarcity limited movement. Air superiority prevented daytime work. What equipment remained was hidden or immobile. Technology, once abstract, became visible hierarchy. Children did not need propaganda to interpret this difference. The machines spoke plainly. They showed which side planned for tomorrow, and which side survived only today. And as these human, tactical, and technological realities overlapped along newly carved roads, they opened deeper questions about leadership, discipline, and what modern strength truly looked like. Angle 4. Leadership on display, authority without noise. For Japanese children, authority had always been loud. Commands were shouted. Orders were ritualized. Power announced itself through volume and urgency. American engineers contradicted that image quietly. Foremen pointed instead of yelled. Officers stood beside machines, not above them. Instructions were brief, repeated only when necessary. Work resumed without ceremony. Even under distant shellfire, the pace rarely changed. This calm was not casual. It was enforced. Engineering units operated under strict schedules tied to frontline needs. Delays risked artillery shortages or medical evacuation bottlenecks. Leadership understood this and modeled composure as a functional requirement. Panic slowed work. Calm sustained it. Children sensed this hierarchy immediately. No one appeared confused. No one argued. Authority flowed downward smoothly, like the roads themselves. Angle 5. The enemy's recognition roads as surrender of space. Japanese soldiers understood the meaning of the roads faster than civilians did. Each completed stretch signaled loss of concealment. Roads denied defenders the advantage of terrain. They allowed Americans to bring firepower where it had previously been impractical. Captured documents and post-war testimonies describe growing alarm as engineering units advanced under protection. Bulldozers were targeted deliberately, yet replacements arrived quickly. Damage slowed progress but never stopped it. For Japanese troops, this was demoralizing. Resistance delayed construction, but could not reverse it. Once a road existed, the battle space changed permanently. Children noticed something related. Japanese soldiers moved farther away. They avoided areas once engineers arrived. Territory did not change hands through fighting alone. It changed through construction. The road marked surrender without negotiation. Angle 6. Moral and psychological weight creation amid destruction. There was a final contradiction children struggled to reconcile. The same soldiers who shelled ridgelines also built infrastructure. The same army that destroyed villages created roads, bridges, and drainage systems. War, which had always meant subtraction, now included addition. This did not feel like kindness. It felt like permanence. Roads implied continuation beyond the battle. They suggested occupation, not passage. For children raised on the belief that the enemy would arrive, devastate, and leave chaos behind, this was profoundly unsettling. The Americans were building a future they intended to use.